Bob McCoskrie, and welcome to Family Matters. I think that here in New Zealand, we're all concerned about the deteriorating rates of mental health, especially amongst our young people and including children. There's increasing rates of anxiety, depressive disorders, intentional self-harm, and sadly suicide. And the rates of suicide for young people in New Zealand are amongst the worst in OECD nations. A study published in November 2019 in the New Zealand Medical Journal looked at trends in antidepressants prescribed to young people between 2007 and 2016, and it found the rates of antidepressants being dispensed were at an all-time high amongst youth. The biggest increase was in the 13 to 17-year-old age group, almost doubled over the 9 years. And hospitalisations for mental behavioural disorders have almost doubled since 2007. Zach Rausch is an associate research scientist at New York University, researcher at the Centre for Humane Technology. But perhaps I think what is taking up most of his time is that he is a lead researcher for a new book, The Anxious Generation, which is due out in March and authored by social psychologist Jonathan Haidt, who is also the author of The Coddling of the American Mind, How Good Intentions and Bad Ideas Are Setting Up a Generation for Failure, which was named one of the best books of 2018 by the New York Times, Financial Times, Bloomberg, London Evening Standard, amongst others. And Jonathan was in the country in 2019. Zach's research suggests that mental health fell off a cliff at the same time and in the same way in the USA, the UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. Zach, thanks so much for being with us. Did I say your surname correctly?
Yes, you did. Yeah,
Rausch.
it's Zach Rausch.
Oh.
And yeah, Bob, it's such a pleasure to be here. And thank you. You did a great introduction. I don't know what else to say.
Well, perhaps we can find some solutions, because we sure as a country are searching for them. Look, just tell us a little bit. Firstly, on Substack, it's called Beyond Babel, and it's the Babel Project, and I assume it's related to Genesis 11 and God confusing the language of the descendants of Noah. But why is your Substack refer to Babel?
So John Haidt and I, we began our Substack. It's actually very close after Babel, and the story is that in the early 2010s, specifically between the years of 2010 and 2015, childhood, but also society more broadly, began to go through an enormous transformation. So this is the period let me just tell you the story about kids. In 2007, we have the launch of the iPhone. And when the iPhone came in early 2007, it was pretty simple. It was kind of, you can call, email, go to the internet. And then in 2008, things really start to change. We get the App Store. So thousands of companies start competing with each other. And this creates a new incentive, a new dynamic in the online world, where new apps start to be created that are very engaging, very enticing, very addictive. And then we start to see new things come out. So in 2009, we have the retweet button is created on Twitter, like button on Facebook, push notifications that send us notifications all day long. 2010, we get the front-facing camera on smartphones and the first social media app for smartphones, which is Instagram. And then in 2012, Facebook buys Instagram, the user base surges upwards. And so the point of this story is within just a few years, the way that we, lived in the online world and really, really started to change, especially for young people. And between 2010 and 2015, childhood and adult life really began to transform. And it became harder for adults to understand each other. And we kind of reached this peak moment of connection in one sense, as everybody was connected through these platforms. But then we started to see huge rises in polarization, a huge decline in teen mental health, and it was like the Tower of Babel fell apart.
Mm.
And so After Babel kind of tells the story of this immersive, new, incredible digital technology that made us the capacity to talk to anyone, everywhere, all over the world. And then how that transformation has really led us to a place where it's very hard to, it's a very different world that we're living in, and we need to find a way forward.
Okay, and you've alluded to the fact that you've seen this trend in the USA, the UK, Canada, Australia, and here in New Zealand. Is that just the countries you've surveyed? Is it a Western European issue? I mean, smartphones are worldwide.
Yeah, I so I have been researching. Um, so again, the Babel project is kind of focused in two parts: what's happening to adults, society, liberal democracy more broadly,
Mm.
and then there's the project of what's happening to kids, and
Right.
that's really
Mm.
my expertise right now. And so, in terms of what is happening to young people across the world. And yeah, what I've found is that when it comes to rates of adolescent anxiety, rates of adolescent depression, self-harm, and even suicide, especially among girls, that has been rising in all five of the countries that you mentioned.
Mm.
But then this problem, it goes beyond these five countries, especially when we look at measures of anxiety, poor mental health, the more extreme cases of a mental illness around suicide and self-harm, that varies more widely across nations. But anxiety and depression, that is rising across all of the Nordic nations, so all
Right.
across Scandinavia. It's
Mm.
happening throughout Western Europe. Um, and what I've found more recently is that it is actually the most individualistic and least religious societies that are showing some of the worst trends among young people.
Wow. That is very interesting. So let's dig into this a little bit more. I mean, I'm fascinated to know. We actually did a report on screen time back in 2015, saying that basically young people were on screens too long. And I was interested to know, is it your research, is it about the screen time and just what they could be doing instead, or is it about what they're looking at on the screen that's causing the problem?
Mm. That's a really important question. And I'm going to say to us, the answer is both.
Mm.
One is just like you said, the displacement. So, especially the social displacement. Let me just give a quick couple of stats just to give a sense with this. So this is among boys in the United States. So in
Mm.
2009, 48% of boys met up with their friends every day. In 2017, that went down to 30%. And this is among 12th grade American boys.
Mm.
In sleep, 2009, 32% of boys said they were sleeping less than 7 hours a night. That went up about 10 percentage points to 41%, 42% in
Mm.
2019. Trends for girls are very similar, often worse. And so, kind of the point of that is to say what what kids and adolescents used to do, in person, social interaction, play, sleep, um, focusing, reading, everything that was happening out there is just happening way less than it did just a decade ago.
Mm.
And that is really significant and has all sorts of, you know, um, problematic outcomes.
Yeah.
Now, it's also what's happening on these apps. And what I think is really important and what's often missed in the conversation around devices is it's often less about what is the content that people are looking at
Mm.
and more about what are the designs of these platforms. And that's why I started with the story of push notifications, retweet buttons, like buttons. We've created a very um, addictive, a very viral, a very kind of it ends up being a very toxic environment for young people to grow up
Mm.
when they are being served algorithmicized content that
Mm.
is feeding their deepest insecurities. When you are seeing images of if you're a young 13-year-old girl seeing thousands of other girls that now you're comparing yourself against. And it's not just other girls, it's photoshopped, fake, filtered images that really distort the way that we're understanding our environment, how we fit into groups. And so it's the design of these platforms that are particularly problematic for young people, plus all of the displacement that's happening. And those two together have really caused a problem. And just one last thing, the main thesis of the anxious generation is that we have been overprotecting kids in the real world, but severely underprotecting them online. And if we're going to try to find a way forward to solve this problem, we need to reverse those two trends.
Okay, yeah, that's a very important point. I'm fascinated to know, though, in your research, does social media have any advantages? I mean, one of the paradoxes is that young people have so much more connection with people. They've got lots of friends, but the paradox is that in life, real friends, they have less because there's less physical interaction in terms of meeting them. They're meeting them all online in their bedroom. I mean, just have you found any advantages of social media for young people?
So, there are lots of people who talk about the benefits of social media. But I want to just make the case that I think that we can do better for kids.
Hmm.
Even though they are able to connect more with each other. When we look at what's happening on these platforms, the amount of cyberbullying, the amount of online predation and exploitation of young girls, the algorithmicized content, the problems that it's causing with body image, and the fact that over the last decade, girls and boys are reporting that they feel more lonely, more disconnected, more sad, more anxious, more depressed. They're self-harming more. It's not clear to me that these platforms are actually selling connection. They seem to be selling disconnection and isolation. And we can provide better opportunities for that connection in the real world. And that is really what I believe we should be striving for. It does serve a purpose and help some kids, especially if you're isolated physically, you live far apart from other people. It's a good way to learn about ideas and people that you didn't know before. But do we need to outsource all of this to unknown people all over the world? What can we do to build strong communities, flourishing families? What can we do in the real world to help kids feel that sense of belonging and connection that they need to thrive, especially as they become adults?
Zach, would you say that parents underestimate just how harmful social media and excess screen time is? I mean, do we really not truly understand exactly how these companies are trying to hook kids, almost like a drug? They have withdrawal symptoms if they don't get it.
Absolutely. I think that it seems somewhat banal sometimes of, these devices, you give them, you watch some videos. But I think that there's two things here. One is that I believe that it's important to recognize that adults and children, adolescents, were very different from each other. Young children and adolescents, they're still developing their brains. They have much lower impulse control, or decision-making processes. And adolescence is a time for a lot of risk-taking, a lot of insecurity and vulnerability. And so this period of life is it's very fragile in some sense. And it needs to be, we need to protect it against a lot of these online forces. And it is quite different from an adult going on social media themselves. And I think that distinction is really important to recognize, that even though it might not feel problematic to you, the experience for younger people is often very different. And the number one, there was an Australian survey among young people The number one reason that they believe that their generation is struggling is social media. So there are a variety of studies like this.
Right.
Um, yeah, and I also think that what's important is a lot of parents do recognize that this is a problem,
Yeah.
but everybody is stuck in what we
Mm.
call a collective action trap.
Mm.
And that is where if any one child decides to get off social media, if any one parent decides, I'm not going to let my kids use social media till they're 16, let's say,
Mm.
they are going to be at a disadvantage because everybody else is going to be on these platforms and the kids might feel more alone, more disconnected. They're going to be asking their parents to get on.
Mm.
And it creates a really difficult situation for families.
Mm.
And to get out of this trap, we need to come together, link up as families, link up as parents, with schools, legislators to come together and decide as a group, as a community, or as a number of families, we're going to delay smartphones until at least age 14
Mm.
and delay social media until 16. And that will make the benefits increase for everyone because everybody will then be off of these platforms and there won't be that social cost.
Okay, and I'd like to come back to those solutions because at the ARC conference that I attended last November in London, Jonathan Haidt spoke via Zoom and gave some of the solutions, which were quite interesting. Let me come back to that. Just a couple of other questions, though. So generally with this type of research, people will poo-hoo it and say, well, correlation is not causation. People blame the global financial meltdown as maybe being one of the issues. And maybe it's just that it's not that children are suffering more with mental illness. It's just that we're being more open about it. The stigma has gone and children are being getting the diagnosis finally, which they weren't getting previously. What's your response to the whole, well, correlation is not causation?
Yeah, I mean, thank God for critics and skeptics because it makes all of us smarter.
Mm.
Um, you know, it's all of what you said is true. Kids are being diagnosed more than they were in the past. There is less stigma, and things have changed regarding reporting. All of that being said, one of the ways that I think about this issue is to think about if there was a murder that happened in a town nearby to you and people were trying to figure out who was the culprit, what happened.
Mm.
And then let's say a couple days later, another happens just a couple towns over. And then another happens across the country. And then another happens in another country. And then you realize that the same thing is happening in multiple countries in the same way at the same time.
Mm.
The range of possible explanations really starts to get smaller and smaller and smaller. And that's what we're seeing here with the smartphone and social media theory. So the evidence, the research does show that there is a correlation between adolescent mental health and social media use, especially for girls. Girls who spend more than 5 hours are on social media per day are 3 times more likely to have depression than girls who don't use it. Mm. And, what's important to note is the average girl is spending approximately 3 to 4 hours a day on these platforms. And
Well, that would be a small amount, wouldn't it? I think a lot of kids are spending up to 8 hours a day, I think, in some of the surveys.
Right. So average of around 4 hours on social media, screen time, 8 to 9 hours a day. Right. So we're talking an enormous amount of time. So correlational studies are showing this. We have a number of longitudinal experimental studies. So the research is pointing to this. And then the mental health data is also showing that these same similar trends happen in many parts across the globe. And this really is the explanation that we believe can best help us understand what has happened to young people so quickly between especially the years of 2010 and 2015. We're not saying that other factors don't contribute to this crisis or may help mitigate or exacerbate it. But if we want to understand what changed and why it changed so fast, that really seems to be pointing to smartphones and social media coming in
Okay.
right around 2010.
Okay, let's look specifically at what you found out about New Zealand. And you've got a Substack which deals specifically just with the data around New Zealand, and I'll put these graphs up just so people can see them. But you looked at anxiety diagnoses, depression diagnoses, and public discharges for intentional self-harm. But can you just sum up, I mean, is New Zealand basically showing exactly the same trend as the UK and Australia and the US?
New Zealand's showing very similar trends. Country to country, there's always some variation going on. And just to paint the picture a little more, so in 2011, among New Zealand 15 to 24-year-olds, they actually had the lowest rate of anxiety across all age groups.
Right.
And that was at 3.8%, right? So that's below everyone above 24, men and women. By 2020, they're at the highest rate among all age groups. So 18.7%, about 1 in 5 young New Zealanders. And this was predominantly driven by girls and young women. And this is from the New Zealand Health Survey. And we see similar things with depression. With hospital discharges, there was a 138% increase in hospital discharges for self-harm episodes since 2010 among 15 to 19-year-old girls. 242% increase for 10 to 14-year-old girls. And just to put some numbers here, in 2009, that was 833 discharges for 10 to 19-year-olds. 2019, it's up to 2,558. So we have this really significant increase across the board. And then even with suicide, the largest increase in suicide across all groups since 2008 has been 15 to 24-year-old girls.
Now, we've done some research on mental health as well of young people, but it's been in watching the trends since what we think is a significant thing that happened in 2007 in New Zealand, and that was the anti-smacking law, or as you call it, spanking. And we, in the data that we looked at, we noticed that some of this trend started back in 2007. So a possible premise is that parenting was undermined, and then this pressure of social media and smartphones came along, and parents just felt that they weren't allowed to deal with it. You know, the message kids got was, well, you can't touch me, you can't tell me what to do. And so it created the perfect storm. Do you think there's some merit to that?
It's an interesting hypothesis. I have not looked into it very deeply, but what I can say is that when we look at how parenting was understood and how parents have been relating to children has really been changing very quickly. And we point more specifically to the 1990s, 1980s, 1990s, especially US, UK, Canada. New Zealand might be a bit different here. But during that time, that was when there was a big rise in the amount of time that parents were spending with their children, which is generally a good thing.
Yeah.
But it was kind of unexpected because family sizes are getting smaller, parents are working more, and so we would expect the opposite to happen. And what we've seen in the research is that the amount of time that kids were allowed to go out, play, be unsupervised with their friends, that was shrinking. And so I think a broader story that we are noticing is that there has been a rise in fearfulness among parents that, one, their children are fragile, that they are, need to be protected from all things in the real world. We can't trust other adults. And that has led to a crisis of resiliency. And for us, in some ways, I think we might be talking about some similar things here, is that kids were not set up to be prepared to handle the shock of this new technology that came in. And so that is why we argue it's the overprotection in the real world, the underprotection online that's driving this crisis.
Mm. Okay. There's lots of things coming together. I mean, when you talked about the 80s and 90s and seeing some of the trends, and actually Canada was another country that you've surveyed, which I don't think I mentioned earlier on. So all very similar countries, UK, Canada, Australia, US, and New Zealand. I mean, the other trend that we've seen, and we've done some reports on this around imprisonment, child poverty, and child abuse, and the
Mm,
link to family structure and
mm.
decreasing rates of marriage, increasing rates of family breakdown. How much do you think that that has contributed to this whole issue? Because parents are more busy, there's more stresses in families, and a parent is probably thinking, well, I don't want to let my child go out and play with strangers, or they could get hurt out on the climbing the tree. Man, it's so safe them just playing a game on the iPad. And, all those factors are coming together. But how much is family breakdown, do you think, contributing to this scenario?
Well, it's a great point. And I want to note again that what we're interested is the change over time and not the necessarily the base rates of what is causing the problem. So like you said, New Zealand has very, very high rates of suicide. There are all sorts of factors that contribute to that. And
Mm,
I do believe that part of what, a lot of research does show that um, different aspects of family dysfunction contributes to young people's poor mental health. And they're definitely more at risk
mm,
of likely the harms that come from using these platforms. If you have uh, one parent at home, it's just much harder to
mm,
manage this new technological world and have to do it all by yourself.
mm.
And so I think that the priority really needs to be about how do we build strong communities? How do we build flourishing families? How do we come together um, today to find ways that we can start to trust each other more, let kids out more. And that especially seems to be one of the strongest predictors of positive mental health is having strong local communities, strong in-person friendships, and a variety of other things that contribute to that.
Okay. As I said, Jonathan Haidt spoke at the ARC conference, and one of the solutions he said was take phones out of schools. And interestingly enough, the new government that has just come in New Zealand, that's one of their policies, because kids are walking around with phones. They're filming bullying incidences. They're even filming times when teachers are perhaps disciplining them. And so this has become, and it's a distraction as well. In fact, funny story, one of my children was at school just when phones were coming in, and we hadn't given her a smartphone, just one of those basic, she can contact us, we can contact her.
Mhm.
And a phone rang in the classroom, or an alert, a social media alert. And so everybody in the class reaches down for their iPhones. This is about 14, 15-year-olds. And my daughter, well, it wasn't an alert because she didn't have a phone that could do that, but she still ruffled down in her bag to pretend that she did have one, because that's the kind of social pressure there is on children to be on these platforms, to have the phones, and then that translates to the parents. Your kid needs a phone, and even schools are saying, well, your kids need a phone. And now we've got schools are finally, I think, realizing just how much they're catching up with I would say, the science actually, and realizing how much harm screen time, excessive screen time, and social media are doing. So that is one of the solutions. You'd agree with that policy, wouldn't you, of no social media and phones during school?
Yeah, I think New Zealand is leading the way on this, and it's really an excellent, I think, an important move to make. These are distraction machines. We don't
Mm,
let kids read during class. We've known for forever that, kids can get very distracted very easily, and there's nothing that is more distracting than having a portal to social media and to the internet in your pocket.
mm,
And we can give back what we call a play-based childhood, reduce the phone-based childhood where we're constantly um, tied to our devices. Schools can do this very easily. And I hope that they're considering are using phone pouches or phone lockers where kids
Mm.
come in at the beginning of the day, hand them
Yeah.
in, and then they get them at the end of the day. And I loved your suggestion about the flip phones or dumb phones that, lots of parents, if you want to give your child a different phone, consider one that doesn't have access to the internet. You can make your calls,
Mm.
but it's much, much less problematic, much less addictive, much less distracting.
Okay. The problem there, of course, is that some parents uh, maybe just don't see the urgency of this. They don't understand the effect it's having on their kids. And so you've got huge peer pressure on the child, and the child will pressure the parents and say, look, I'm the only one without the phone. How do you get around that issue?
Right. So issue number one is we need to come together and recognize, and many people do, that this is
Mm.
a very real problem. This is an international crisis among young people,
Mm.
and most of the evidence is pointing towards that smartphones and social media are really contributing to a crisis in mental health and a crisis in learning. And so again, families uh, recommend that you come together, you find other like-minded parents, and you work together by deciding that together you're going to delay smartphones till at least 14, social media till 16, continue to pressure and advocate for phone-free schools. And then at the same time, work on building community, work on giving kids more of the autonomy and unsupervised play that they had for most of evolutionary human history, and allowing us to build that resiliency within our kids, and also protecting them from this very unstable new virtual world, which we are not ready as young people to fully handle, and then allow them to thrive
Mm.
in that world as they get older.
Now, did you just say smartphones at 14, social media at 16? Was that right?
That is the main recommendations that, the norms that we can set, that seem very, very doable, is
Yeah.
delaying smartphones till 14, getting them out of, in the US, it's middle school. I don't know exactly the age brackets for in New Zealand, but really
It's about
delaying, pushing
13,
past
14.
puberty.
Mm.
Yeah, pushing past puberty is what's key.
Mm.
Puberty is the key period where we've seen harm from these devices and from the platforms. And so if we can delay until after that, and then social media a little bit later, we believe it'll do a lot of good.
Okay, Zach, I think you just became the most unpopular person amongst our young people in New Zealand with that recommendation. But interestingly, with the recommendation, while parents may be cheering, how do the social media companies respond to this thought? I mean, we recently saw the head of Meta apologizing for the effect of social media on
Yeah.
children. You know, are they willing to come to the party on this, or are we fighting? Are they part of the enemy?
I wouldn't do they're not the villains, but they're also stuck in their own traps,
Mm.
right? There's all sorts of business incentives, all sorts of profit motives that lead companies to try to get younger and younger and younger users, get more and more time on screen. Why? Because their business model is
Mm.
all about attention. How do I capture more attention? Because I'm going to sell that attention to advertisers, and that's how they make their money.
Mm.
And so these products are designed in a way, their profit models are designed in a way that is all about keeping keeping people on screen longer.
Mm.
And, as adults, we can make choices about how we want to use these products, what we think about it. But for, over a century, we've come to the understanding that we need to protect kids from all sorts of products, especially when those incentives are in a way that harms them. So we've done this with cigarettes. We've done this with a variety of other products
Mm.
where we really require some sort of legislative efforts to
Yeah.
impose costs on these companies.
Yeah. And I guess helping parents understand the threat it is as well. Just finally, Zach, really appreciate your time. Just the book, The Anxious Generation, it's due out in April, is it? Did I say?
It is. It'll be in the market on March 26th.
Ooh, okay. And just a quick sell for that, because you're the researcher behind it. Why should parents buy it in New Zealand?
So we cover everything that I've talked about in this podcast, but much, much more. We talk about the crisis among young boys, the crisis among girls uniquely, and a little bit more about the historical trends. And then the final part of the book is all about what we can do as parents, what we can do as teachers, as legislators. And it gives a path forward for all of us, how to break out of these collective action traps. And I hope that it's helpful to parents and to anybody who wants to understand the impact of the new phone-based lives that we're all living.
Okay, looking forward to that book. I've already read The Coddling of the American Mind, and that was a fabulous one as well. Zach, really appreciate your time. Thank you for your research, and we look forward to the book next month.
Bob, thank you so much for inviting me on.